Hi, this is Manjula Narayan, books editor, Hindustan Times, and today I have with me Narayani Basu, who's done a wonderful biography on VP Menon, the unsung architect of modern India. Okay, so now Narayani, like everybody knows about Sardar Patel, but nobody knows about VP Menon, who was his like right hand man, and who actually did the nitty gritties, did the actual work of getting these princes to join the Indian Union and creating India as we know it today. So talk about that.
So that's actually one of the reasons that I chose to work on VP Menon because you read his name in every book that's or that's based on the transfer of power. You see VP Menon making a cameo appearance. He's referred to as Mountbatten's brilliant political reforms commissioner. He's referred to as Sardar Patel's right hand man. He's referred to as the guy who helped Sardar Patel with the integration of the states. But nobody really knows A, of the man, and B, of the kind of career that he had, right? So most of his appearances are in other books in the summer of 1947 when India's coming towards transfer of power, and then thereafter when integration and accession is happening. What I wanted to portray was the story of VP Menon, who essentially started his career in 1914, and then continued in government service until 1951. So he was basically at the front lines of India's constitutional reform. So it was a very strange position because he was both at the front lines but on the sidelines until 1935, should I say. And I essentially wanted to tell that story. It's not known to anybody. In fact, people confuse VP Menon with Krishna Menon.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, when I first began writing this project, people would ask me what I was writing on, and I would say, VP Menon, and they would say, India's first defense minister. And I would say, no, this is VP Menon who was Sardar Patel. In fact, I had to start referring to him as Sardar Patel's right hand man, and then people would be like, oh, again, I wanted to do away with the fact that, there's this popular myth that he was Sardar Patel's right-hand man, which is true, but that was not all that he was. He was very much his own man. I mean, having gone through government service from 1914, he was no one's man. He was his own man. So I wanted to essentially tell the story of somebody who has A, not ever been written about, B, about whom there's so much confusion that essentially he was a figure of obscurity. Nobody really knew who he was. Nobody knew what he had done, which was so much more than just the transfer of power and the integration. So I wanted to tell that story first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So should we read the flap so that everybody knows what the book is about?
Sure.
With his initial plans for an independent India in tatters, a desperate viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, turned to his senior-most Indian civil servant, Vapla Pangunni Menon, or VP, giving him a single night to devise an alternative, coherent and workable plan for independence. Menon met his stringent deadline, presenting the Menon Plan, which would play midwife to India's birth as a free nation. As Reforms Commissioner to India's last three viceroys, Linlithgow, Wavell and Mountbatten, and then as Secretary State's Ministry, VP used his enormous intellect, diligence and powers of persuasion to integrate 565 states into the Indian Union. These included Junagadh, Hyderabad and Kashmir, the big three with a history of dissent. As Sardar's right-hand man, VP Menon was unarguably the architect of the modern Indian state. Yet startlingly little is known about this bureaucrat, patriot and visionary. In this definitive biography, Menon's great-granddaughter, Narayani Basu, explores the man behind the public figure, his unconventional personal life, his determination to give women the right to vote, and to his strategy, at once ruthless and subtle, to get the princely states to accede to India. Through letters, diaries, and files long forgotten, the author looks into the world of a deeply flawed, intensely private, fiercely ambitious man. With unprecedented access to Menon's papers and his taped off the record and explosively frank interviews in India and the UK, VP Menon, the unsung architect of modern India, not only covers the life and times of a man unjustly consigned to the footnotes of history, but also changes our perception of how India, as we know it, came into being. Equally, the book candidly explores the man behind the public figure, his unconventional personal life, and his private conflicts, which made him channel his energy into public service. Narayani Basu, a historian and academic, marries rigorous research with a flair for storytelling to provide riveting portraits of the personalities of the Indian independence movement, including stalwarts like Gandhi, Jinnah, Nehru, Patel, and Mountbatten, to bring fresh perspectives and insights into a period that continues to capture the imagination of every Indian citizen. Right. So, what I found interesting was, yeah, you're his great granddaughter,
Yes.
but you haven't you haven't eulogized this man, and you've spoken about his personal life as well as his political, contribution with frankness, which is kind of, Indian biographers, and especially if you're family, you kind of like paper over things.
Yeah.
You haven't done that. So talk about that.
I didn't want to do that. I think one of the great flaws of Indian biographies has been, as you said, eulogizing the person that they're writing about. I didn't want
Less now, maybe,
less now, but
Yeah.
certainly the older tradition was to present a sort of eulogy of the man they were writing about, man/woman. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to present the story. I wanted to present a man who was human, like all of us. We're not angels, we're not saints, we have our flaws. And I think that essentially goes into what makes a good biography. Is a good retelling of the complexities of human nature. For me, a good biography marries the personal and the private and the public, right? You could be an immensely great man in your professional life, but you could also be, not so great in your personal life. And it's not for us to judge that, but to sort of portray that as it was. I didn't want to draw any kind of conclusions from what VP Menon might have done in his personal life. Certain facts were facts, and I have chosen to portray them as facts because, what is human nature if you can't portray it, warts and all? And that is essentially what I've tried to do with this book. I think that that's something that is beginning to be done more now, and I really, really appreciate it because the great thing about writing about people who have gone before us is that we can so easily sit in judgment. And we can equally sit here and write hagiographies. I didn't want to do either. I wanted to sort of strike a happy medium if I could without judging or, being overly praising the man overly much.
Okay, but as him being an ancestor, really. But maybe because you're many generations separated from him, and his,
Yeah, I
So as family, it wasn't that problematic.
No, it wasn't problematic, as you said, because I'm many generations apart from him. I obviously never knew him. So for me, writing about him,
He's your grandfather's
he is
father.
my great grandfather from my maternal side, to be very specific.
maternal side.
So he's my mother's grandfather.
Okay.
And I, like I said, I never knew him. So for me, writing about this didn't come with a family bias as such. It was like writing about any other man, any other figure of history.
Yes.
So that objectivity helped. I've often been asked, were you very invested in telling his story because he was your great grandfather? And my answer has always been no. It's certainly a moment of great pride that I'm actually able to write about my great grandfather, but it's coming after the fact, after I've actually researched extensively the story of this man. But he has always been a man who is sitting behind the scenes doing great things for me. He's never been, oh, this is what my great grandfather is doing at X point in history. And I think that's been a great advantage while writing this book, to be honest.
Okay. So, the Krishna Menon biography
Yes.
has also just come,
Yes.
come out.
Yes.
So, there's competition between the two Menons,
Menons,
on the
yeah.
bookshelf
Yeah.
as well. Talk about that.
So essentially, like I said, I mean, VP Menon's often been confused with Krishna Menon. So it's perhaps ironical that both biographies have come out at this point in time. And, perhaps it's forcing many readers
It's
to
Mallu
choose.
Pride
It's
season.
Mallu Pride season. And perhaps readers are being forced to choose which Menon they want to read about first. That said, like, they were very, very different Menons.
Yes.
Krishna Menon was immensely privileged. He was,
Yes.
he was born for the public limelight. He was a born politician. And he strode into the limelight like he desired it, which he did. He was never without controversy. He was somebody who took to the public stage and lived there like he was
Yes.
born and bred for it. VP Menon was completely separate. I mean, he was a completely different individual. He came really speaking from rural Kerala. He ran away from school when he was 13. He was a coolie in the gold mines in Kolar before he actually worked his way up to becoming an overseer in Kolar. He would go on to sell hand towels briefly outside Victoria Terminus. His appointment in the Home Department in the government of India was a fluke. And he worked his way up completely from the bottom rungs of government service to the very top.
Entirely self-made.
Entirely self-made. He was not averse to speaking his mind. He was certainly a very opinionated man. And he usually did not mince his words, which left him with very few friends. I mean, he was somebody who never actively courted the public stage. And it was interesting when I was writing about 1947 that the two key men of that time, Nehru and Patel, both had Menons at their right hands. Nehru had Krishna Menon, Sardar Patel had VP Menon. So there were two very different Menons.
Wonder whether they liked each other.
No, they did not. Long story short, they did not like each other.
I'm not surprised.
They did not. But yes, I mean, two very different men and two very different Menons.
Okay. And what I liked about the book also is that how you've woven in a lot of details about other characters.
Yeah.
And let me read this little bit, which is fantastic. I started laughing when I read it. During the course of the conference, VP heard much about the Maharaja of Alwar, a flamboyant homosexual possessed both of immense charm and cruelty, who believed himself to be a reincarnation of Ram. It was at a reception at Buckingham Palace that he saw Alwar's eccentricities in full play for himself. The Maharaja despised any kind of physical contact with foreigners, ostentatiously wearing black silk gloves to prevent his royal personage from being defiled. At the reception, his advisors were frantic. The King Emperor would be advancing down the line of guests, graciously shaking hands with each. Alwar could hardly extend a gloved hand to His Majesty. Polite warnings to Alwar ahead of the reception went unheeded. The sight of the Maharaja awaiting his turn in the royal queue with his hands neatly clasped before him sent his Indian advisors into a panic. K.M. Panikar was dispatched to warn Alwar that if he displayed such discourtesy to the king, he might well be deposed. Tension mounted as the king moved smiling down the line. A split second before the king extended his hand to shake Alwar's, the Maharaja bowed so low and deep his nose almost touched the ground. He then rose, his gloved hands piously folded. In his suave way, Alwar had contrived to both pay his humble obeisance to his liege and to preserve what he considered to be his personal honor. So there are lots of these little bits in the book which I just loved,
It's for me, history is more about personalities like that and, the things they did and their eccentricities and quirks than it is, years and blocks of facts and statistics. So for me, this particular period is, I mean, when I was researching it, it's peopled with so many eccentric characters that honestly, I had a ball researching this particular part of history because there were just so many quirky rulers and there were so many, I mean, quirky politicians, quirky leaders, and there was VP Menon in the middle navigating his way through all this. I mean, the anecdote you read out, for instance, VP Menon was right there watching this happen. Um, and then there were so many stories that he got to hear. I mean, for instance, there was the Nawab of Rampur who used to entertain, a lot of royal visitors. And there was one particular ruler he was entertaining who insisted that he had to see the cow every day. He had to see the face of a cow every day. And this was somewhat of a predicament for the Nawab because his guest rooms were on the first floor of his palace. Now, how could he get a cow up there? So he solved this by getting a crane from a nearby sugar factory. Every morning, a cow was lifted via the crane.
The poor cow!
To dangle outside the guest apartment windows so that his royal guest could part his curtains and behold a cow. So, so there are things like this all across from this entire period, and it just
we sound very sanitized and sane right now.
We sound very boring in comparison. I mean, life was lived in Technicolor in those days, on a scale that we can't even imagine. And to us now, we sit and laugh. For those guys, this was the norm. I mean, they didn't know any other way to be. And for me, that's what history is. That's what makes it so colorful.
That's true.
So yeah.
Okay, and this you mentioned here how he was insistent about the vote for women.
Yes.
Let's talk about that.
So this actually started when VP went to the Round Table conferences in 1930. It was the first time he'd been abroad. Certainly the first time he'd crossed the Kala Pani, so to say. And he was fascinated by what he saw in London. He was at the heart of the empire. He could see and he was exposed to ways of life that were completely alien to him. For instance, he didn't understand how the driver of a car could enter the same restaurant and eat, perhaps not at the same table, but certainly at the same restaurant. He was for the first time actively mingling with princes. He was mingling with politicians. And in between sessions of the conference, he took the time to go around the city and see what it had to offer. And that was a time when London was experiencing a very vocal movement for women to have the vote. Now, by 1930, VP had been exposed to the typing of the Montagu-Chelmsford report. He'd been exposed to, various committees that had been set up to oversee the implementation of the Government of India Act 1919. He'd seen Jallianwala Bagh. He'd seen politics in India beginning to get a voice of its own. He also knew that there were women in India who were certainly fighting for women to have the vote. Certainly, Sarojini Naidu was very vocal. There was Mrinalini Sen, who was the wife of Nirmal Chandra Sen, who was the son of Keshav Chandra Sen. All of these women were fighting for women to have an equal say in politics. Most of them were infuriated that, they were subject to the laws of the British Empire. They paid taxes. They could even own property, but they were not allowed to vote. And when he came back from the round tables and when the Government of India Act of 1935 was being put in place, he was actively given a chance to ensure this. How was he given a chance to ensure this? Because his supervisor, and here I have to say that he was immensely lucky in that he encountered English supervisors who were incredibly encouraging, who never saw it in themselves to sort of suppress an Indian subordinate who had ideas that could so clearly be seen to be above his station. They never felt that, okay, you're Indian, you don't need to put across your views. They actively encouraged whatever he had to say. So in the 1930s, his immediate supervisor was somebody called Hawthorne Lewis. Hawthorne Lewis was Reforms Commissioner at that point, and he was one of the first few English superiors that VP had who was incredibly encouraging. He was also providentially somebody who didn't keep well too much of the time.
Okay.
And as the Government of India Act was put in place, one of the conditions was the 1937 elections would basically govern this. VP was told, look, you are in charge of formulating the electoral rolls for the 1937 elections. That actually gave him the in to put women on the vote, on the voting list. And he took that chance. And in fact, I mean, obviously he did a lot more. He would ensure, for instance, that illiterate people in the country, who made up quite a vast percentage at that point, they were allowed to be given, colored boxes and symbols so that they could see who they were voting for. And they also had a say in the country's future.
So these very central things for us, like universal suffrage,
which we take for granted.
Yeah, which we take for granted.
He had a definite hand in that. And essentially that is and he'd been brought up in a very strong matrilineal environment.
Yes.
His mother had been a very strong woman. By this point, he had met who would become eventually his second wife. And she was also a very incredibly strong woman. So he had encountered strong women, women with minds of their own, women with...
Yeah, so somebody who comes from a matrilineal background, not giving a vote would be like strange.
And yet he needn't have.
Yeah.
He very, very well needn't have done it. But for him, he just thought, this is a shame, essentially, that, here are women with such clear ideas of what they want from their country. With women who are of such decided opinions, why aren't they being given a say in their own country's future? And so he went ahead and gave women the right to vote.
So that's the story of why we can vote and because places like New Zealand, Canada, they got the vote much later.
And it's something that's often dismissed, in a sentence or two. But I think it's something that deserves much more than a sentence or two, essentially speaking, because, we owe a lot to him for doing that. So.
Okay, and with that we'll end. So we do owe a lot to VP Menon, the unsung architect of modern India. So go out and get this book, so that you know what you owe him. Thank you so much, Narayani.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.